In the tumultuous landscape of Central America, mid-20th century, few political entities project as elongated a contour as the Somoza Dynasty of Nicaragua, a complex web of power, business, and Machiavellian methods, founded by Patriarch Anastasio Somoza Garcia and continued by his two sons, Luis and Anastasio. Anastasio Somoza, the youngest of the brothers, was the last in the succession and the only one still alive to see the end of their wealthy empire with which they ruled for more than 40 years, bringing economic development and political conflict while becoming the wealthiest family in Central America. Made possible thanks to the unwavering support of the United States, a country that several times had militarily occupied Nicaragua and left the Somoza as their trusted family in the country. Today we will learn about the life of Anastasio Somoza de Baile, the youngest son and the last of the Somozas who ruled Nicaragua. This is Reynaldo Carrillo speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia, and I invite you to like this video, to leave your comments, to share it with your acquaintances. Anastasio Somoza de Baile was born in León, Nicaragua on December 5th of... His father was also named Anastasio Somoza. At that time, he was a wealthy coffee landowner. He had not yet become a general and president of Nicaragua, which we will discuss later. His mother, also from the socialite scene, was Salvador de Baile's housekeeper. From both his mother's and father's side, Anastasio descended from significant personalities in Nicaraguan society, from senators, prominent figures, landowners, renowned doctors, a great-grandfather who was president of the country, to important captains of the time when Nicaragua was part of the Spanish Empire. Young Anastasio, nicknamed Tachito by his father and friends, would later grow to be 190 centimeters tall. He attended primary school in Nicaragua, and in 1936 he began his long and close relationship with the United States. After studying at St. Leo School in Florida, he and his older brother Luis Somoza continued their education at the La Salle Military Academy on Long Island, New York. Since the Republic of Nicaragua was proclaimed in 1856, the country was the center of internal political disputes between liberals and conservatives, as well as a point of interest for colonial powers, especially from the very nearby United States, a country that, since the Monroe Doctrine, had assumed itself as protector and hegemon of the entire American continent. After the refusal of the Nicaraguan liberal government to grant the United States the construction of an interoceanic canal in Nicaragua, and the rejection of this same government, entablar new loans with capital from the United States. The North American power militarily occupies Nicaragua in 1911, turning it into a sort of protectorate. United States troops leave the country in 1933, but they leave behind the National Guard, which would be the organization that maintains control of the country. And in command of the National Guard, they left a trustworthy man for Washington and Nicaragua, Anastasio Somoza Garcia, the father of our protagonist. In command of the National Guard, Somoza Sr. was accused of being the mastermind in 1934 of the execution of Augusto Sandino, the famous Nicaraguan guerrilla who stood up to the American occupation. And it's worth mentioning that both Sandino and Somoza Sr. were members of the Masonic Lodge. As Anastasio Jr. studied in the U.S., his father worked to consolidate power in their home country. He became leader of the Nationalist Liberal Party and organized a military coup against his political uncle, then-President Juan Bautista Sacasa. By 1937, appointed by the Legislative Assembly, Anastasio Somoza Sr. formally assumes as president of Nicaragua, thus initiating a family dynasty that would last over 40 years. Meanwhile, after high school, Tachito would enter the famed West Point Military Academy in the United States. On July 3, 1943, graduating as an engineer from that prestigious institution in 1946. The following year, at just 22 years of age, Anastasio Son would be appointed by his father as Inspector General of the Nicaraguan National Guard. After coming back to Nicaragua, Tachito starts to lead various family enterprises. Being president and with a great unscrupulous ability for business, Anastasio Somoza, father, manages to make the Somozas the richest family in Central America during the 40s and 50s. By December 10th of 1950, Anastasio Jr. would marry his cousin, Jope Portocarrero de Baile, with whom he would have 5 children. They lived in New York for a while, where Anastasio Jr. also became a qualified pilot. But they decide to return to Nicaragua when his father tells him that he will run for the presidency again and that he needs him in the country. Somoza Sr. served as president between 1937 and 1947 and between 1950 to 1956, until an opposing poet shot him 4 times, causing his death. With the approval of the United States, to whom he was always servile, Somoza's father ruled as a single authority while maintaining democratic forms. Elections were held and there was a Congress, the presidency of which would be occupied during this period by the eldest son of Somoza's father, named Luis Somoza. During the rule of the first Somoza, trade and industry would notably grow, and a good portion of the nation's infrastructure would be modernized. Alongside this, Managua, Nicaragua's capital, would become Central America's most prosperous and touristic city. However, significant portions of the population remained in precarious conditions. With the assassination of Anastasio Somoza Sr., his sons would inherit a fortune of $200 million from that time, a fortune they would triple in the following decades. Power in Nicaragua was a family matter in which the surnames were constantly repeated. When Somoza Sr. died, his eldest son, Luis Somoza, being president of the Congress, assumed the role of president of the Republic to finish his father's term until 1957. That same year, Luis Somoza would be elected to continue in the position of president, while his younger brother, Tachito, held the position of chief director of the National Guard. During his presidency, Luis Somoza's policy would maintain the economic and social development that the country had been showing under his father's command. However, the opponents of Somoza's regime were growing, and his presidency was filled with protests and armed rebellions against him. Luis Somoza would govern until 1963, and the last years of his presidency were filled with conflicts, political prisoners, repression, and censorship. With the advent of Fidel Castro's rise to power in 1959 in Cuba, an attempt begins from Havana to destabilize the government of Nicaragua. For their part, the old Nicaraguan guerrilla groups commanded by Augusto Sandino continued to exist and change over time during Somoza's rule, until several of them formed in the early 60s into the Sandinista National Liberation Front. And now, backed by Havana, they step up their armed operations against Luis Somoza's regime. At the same time, the opposition to Somoza's regime, which was initially mostly liberal, begins to be overshadowed by the openly Marxist and communist opposition. By 1963, Luis Somoza leaves the presidency, but both he and Tachito would continue to hold power as chiefs of the National Guard and chiefs of the new presidents who were subservient to them. By 1967, given the health weakness of his older brother to run again as a presidential candidate, Luis presents his brother Anastasio Somoza of Dance as the standard-bearer for the presidential election. This generates protests from those who denounce the extension of a family dictatorship. During an aggressive campaign against the opposition, consisting of conservatives unhappy with Somocism, socialists, and liberals, a campaign in which even the government forces ended the lives of more than 100 opponents in a demonstration, 2 weeks before the election, Anastasio Somoza Jr. is elected as the new president of Nicaragua. The government of the youngest Somoza was established at a time when the baton in matters of peaceful power transfer and democracy was carried. Venezuela, with its nascent bipartisanship, which with its vast monetary and diplomatic resources. Venezuela joined, along with governments like Panama, Colombia, the Soviet Union, the United States, and Cuba, to interfere in the politics of other countries in the region, delivering money, legitimacy, and weapons to regular and insurgent political groups. But we will come back to this later. With his election, Somoza becomes president while he was head of the National Guard, obtaining an undisputed power base in Nicaragua. His government maintained an economic policy oriented towards private investment, and during his presidency, the gross domestic product doubled. During those years, important American financial conglomerates established themselves in the country, such as Bank of America, Chase, Manhattan Bank, and other bodies of that stature, while the Somoza family directly or indirectly controlled more than half of Nicaragua's private sector. Simultaneously, labor reforms typical of the era were advocated, granting workers certain benefits in their working conditions. Important medical, educational, and cultural centers were opened, and the social work was fronted by Anastasio's wife. Also, tourism increased substantially during this period. However, it was criticized that public spending on social issues was insufficient to address the population's ongoing deficiencies. For instance, it was denounced that for 1970, more than half of the population was illiterate, and less than 30% of the children had more than 6 years of schooling. Likewise, it was denounced in conditions worse than the average in other countries of the region, with more than half of the population without access to potable water and only 10% with appropriate medical care. Anastasio's son faced opposition from various sectors of the country. An important part of this opposition came from sectors of the Catholic clergy, consisting of Jesuit priests with ideological affinities towards the Marxist opposition and enthusiastic about the ideas of liberation theology. Simultaneous to the unarmed opposition, there was an armed opposition that launched attacks leaving hundreds dead, and in retaliation, the Somoza's military left hundreds more dead. Somoza and his family visited Nixon and Emperor Hirohito. For his part, Tachito begins an extramarital relationship with Dinora Sampson, who breaks social protocol. She displays lavish expenses and creates scandal and gossip among the national elite due to the influence she came to have over Somoza's decisions. By 1971, Tachito's presidential term was concluding. So in 1972, the Nationalist Liberal Party and the Conservative Party agree to elect a constituent assembly to eliminate the restrictions on presidential re-election. So on May 1, 1972, Somoza leaves the presidency in the hands of a junta or triumvirate. However, he remains the leader of the National Guard in the party. Meanwhile, the unarmed opposition, led by Pedro Joaquin Chamorro Cardenal and his newspaper La Prensa, fueled discontent, denouncing malnutrition, access to health, illiteracy, and the lack of housing. From the Catholic Church, Archbishop Miguel Obando y Bravo wrote letters criticizing the government. On the 23rd of December, 1972, an earthquake devastates Managua, leaving about 10,000 dead and around 50,000 families affected. Then the earthquake and elements from the National Guard joined in looting the few remaining businesses in Managua. In turn, the government, de facto controlled by Somoza, receives international aids that were arbitrarily managed by his family and the National Guard. In this context, nonetheless, Anastasio Somoza Jr. is re-elected to the presidency in September of 1974, but he was a weaker Somoza than the one in his first term. Simultaneously, the Sandinista guerrillas were growing stronger with the support of Jesuit priests and the support of Fidel Castro in Cuba, Carlos Andrés Pérez in Venezuela, and the Soviet Union. Thus, they intensified campaigns of violence, Focoism, and destabilization in a war of attrition, to which the National Guard responded with curfews, media shutdowns, arbitrary arrests, and disappearances. For example, the state of conflict that was occurring. A few weeks after Anastasio Somoza's son assumed the presidency, a Sandinista front commando stormed the Minister of Agriculture's house and kidnapped several cabinet members. With the mediation of the Archbishop of Managua, the guerrillas managed to secure the release of 8 Sandinista prisoners, including future President Daniel Ortega, as well as $8 million, the mass media publication of their denunciations, and a plane to go to Cuba. In response, Somoza implements the state of siege and press censorship, which would last 33 months until 1977. The eldest son of Tachito, also named Anastasio Somoza Portocarrero, had become his father's right-hand man. And more than one thought that he would soon be ready for the dynastic succession. But by the late 70s, Somoza's fortune was immeasurable. Speculation was it ranged between $500 and $1 billion. From hundreds of properties and businesses in Nicaragua to major companies in the United States and several European countries, in the area of real estate, hospitality, services, gold extraction, and exploitation of natural and mining resources such as oil. To Somoza's misfortune, the interventionist foreign policy of the United States began to wane after the Vietnam War. Then a movement of American public opinion in favor of isolationism emerged, leading to, for example, small nations like Nicaragua no longer being considered a threat to the security of the United States. Instead, they looked at the Central American and Caribbean region as a laboratory for new political ideas. Such attitudes were those of Jimmy Carter in Nicaragua between 1977 and 1978, who, with his Secretary of State, for the first time abandoned the long-standing American track of supporting the Somozist regime and those sectors of that country that were fighting against communism. During October of 1977, a group of prominent Nicaraguan businessmen and academics, known as the 12, were meeting in Costa Rica and forming an anti-Somoza alliance. The 12 strengthened the Sandinista front by insisting on Sandinista representation in any post-Somoza government. This growing conflict, which warned of a possible civil war, accentuated the flight of capital in Nicaragua. At the same time, Venezuelan diplomacy was pressuring for multilateral organizations not to approve new loans for the Somoza regime. After more than 40 years in which the Somoza family had led the fate of Nicaragua, the traditional supports it had during these decades began to be lost. In the midst of the repression to the dissidents of Somochismo, the opposition and the armed resistance were consolidated. The final act of the fall of the Somoza era began on January 10, 1978, when Pedro Joaquin Chamorro, one of the main figures of the opposition, was assassinated. The opposition held the president and his guards responsible for the homicide, which led to massive demonstrations against the regime. The Episcopal Conference of the Catholic Church in Nicaragua issued a pastoral letter that was highly critical of the government and the opposition parties. They all unanimously called for the resignation of Anastasio Somoza Era. On January 23, 1978, a national strike begins, including both the public and private sectors. Anastasio Somoza Era, for his part, claimed that his intention was to stay in power until the end of his presidential term in 1981. The stagnation caused most private companies to decide to suspend participation in the strike in less than 2 weeks. However, the Sandinista Front guerrillas launched a series of harsh attacks across the country. But the better-equipped National Guard was able to maintain military superiority for the time being. The indiscriminate attacks against elements of the civilian population that were sheltering the insurgents and the excesses by members of the National Guard further tarnished the international image of the Somoza government. In February of 1978, the United States government suspended all military aid to the Nicaraguan government, in addition to having withdrawn political and diplomatic support, forcing Somoza to purchase weapons and equipment on the international market. Israel, a country that had received money from the Somoza since its creation, was pressured by Jimmy Carter not to sell weapons to Nicaragua. Nicaragua's economy further declined, with increased capital flight, lack of investment, inflation, and unemployment. By May of 1978, 4 factions of the heterogeneous Nicaraguan opposition joined together to create the Broad Opposition Front, so as to try to pressure President Somoza for a negotiated solution to the crisis. The Sandinista Front was not represented in the Broad Opposition Front, but the ties between the guerrillas and the rest were impossible to deny. So eventually, the Sandinista Front formalizes its participation in the Broad Front, creating the United People's Movement, which included the most visible and open left-wing groups. Among unions, student organizations, and communist and socialist parties. August 22, 1978. A group of guerrillas took the National Palace and held nearly 2,000 officials and members of the Congress government as hostages for 2 days. The crisis was resolved in 2 days of negotiation, and the results of this negotiation favored the uprising and further tarnished the image of the Somoza government. The palace takeover invigorated the opposition. The humiliation of the dictatorship also affected morale within the National Guard, which forced Anastasio Somoza Era to replace many of his officers to prevent a coup d'etat. By the end of 1978, the failure of the Broad Front to achieve a negotiated solution improved the position of the armed insurrection movement. In October, the 12 withdrew from the negotiation process when the Broad Front persisted in seeking a negotiated arrangement with Somoza. Meanwhile, the armed movement was growing stronger and the fighting was intensifying. The Organization of American States and the UN issue resolutions condemning the government of Nicaragua. In December 1978, the Sandinista front strengthens even more when Cuban mediation leads to an agreement between the three factions of the Sandinista front, which ensures that in March of '79, a united Sandinista front is finally consolidated. The Sandinistas, armed to the teeth, began an offensive in May as the National Guard was losing control of many parts of the country. In June, in Costa Rica, Daniel Ortega, Violeta Barrios de Chamorro, and other opposition elements set up a government in exile, which was recognized by Panama, Venezuela, and Cuba. With a virtual dominion the Sandinistas had over a part of Nicaragua, except for Managua, and the political and military isolation, Anastasio Somoza begins to seriously consider resignation. The Sandinistas pledged to form a democratic and pluralistic government. Somoza finally resigns on July 17, 1979, from the presidency of Nicaragua. He hands over power to Herculano and gets on a plane with immense amounts of money, the coffins of his father and brother, and sets off for Miami. But there, Jimmy Carter denies him political asylum, so he continues his exile to the south, under the shelter of the Paraguayan Alfredo Stroessner, where he buys a farm and a house in Asunción. Meanwhile, in Nicaragua, the Sandinistas forcibly overthrew the government of Herculano and seized power amidst violent lootings from what remained of Managua. Just under a year later, at 54 years old, Somoza leaves his mansion in Asunción on September 17, 1980. A commando unit comprised of 4 men and 3 women trained in Cuba stages an elaborate maneuver with a rocket-propelled grenade, 7-rocket attack against Somoza's armored Mercedes, which requires 2 rocket detonations and no fewer than 60 semi-automatic weapon shots to end the life of Anastasio Somoza de Baile. Looking back at this tumultuous period in Central American history, it is important to remember the role that the Somoza dynasty and Anastasio Somoza de Baile played, in particular in shaping the political landscape of the region. The fall of the Somozas in Nicaragua was followed by an equally turbulent and violent era. To this day, Nicaragua remains under the command of the Sandinistas. The last words in Somoza's resignation letter said, "I have fought against communism, and I believe that when the truths come out, history will prove me right." The Somoza reign goes down in history as one of strong-handed peace in a violent country where political rebellions were normal during the 20th century. Today, some also remember the economic development that Somoza's stability brought. The Somozas always had the support of the United States government, which backed the Somoza regime with the argument of fighting communism in a region strategic for the North American power. Some today see the Somozas as a tyrannical family that took over the country, while others see them as those who managed to bring stability and development to Nicaragua without succumbing to electoral democratization processes. I hope you enjoyed this video by Ronaldo Carrillo. This is The New Encyclopedia. Follow us on our Instagram account, The New Encyclopedia. Help us out on our Patreon and give this video a like, share it, leave your comments, and turn on the bell for notifications.